Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. South Korea's first Vice Foreign Minister is currently in Washington for talks on North Korea with his American and Japanese counterparts. He's expected to again press President Moon Jae-in's proposal to formally declare an end to the 1950 to 1953 Korean War. The administration in Seoul hopes such a move, if realised, might coax the North back to talks on its denuclearization and soothe tensions.
Now, this also comes as North Korea is holding a rare event, namely the so-called Fifth Conference of the Frontrunners of the Three Revolutions. For more, we are joined by Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London. Good morning, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
Now, let's start with the talks in Washington. Many experts say the U.S. isn't interested in a move to formally end the Korean War, with some suggesting it would be too much of a concession and purely symbolic in any case. What is your view on this?
Well, I think there's a difference, of course, between the declaration, end of war declaration, and a formal end to the Korean War. It seems to me that the U.S. wouldn't be opposed to the declaration at this point or at an earlier stage in a negotiation process with North Korea, but a formal end to the Korean War that would open the way to a peace regime in the Korean Peninsula might be something that Washington is not willing to negotiate or to sign right now. We would need to see a process taking place before this happens. So I do think that the U.S. is willing to make a move, but I also do think that this move may be more symbolic with an end of war declaration rather than something that would put a formal change, legal change to the situation in the Korean Peninsula.
And how much of this push do you think is down to President Moon Jae-in wanting to ensure his legacy is that of a peacemaker? And given that his term ends in just a few months, how do you assess his dealings with North Korea over the past 5 years?
Well, President Moon always said that any potential reconciliation or peace process with North Korea would be a long-term process, that he wanted to create the conditions for sustainable peace, for a sustainable peace process. And I think in this respect, a peace declaration would actually help, because whoever is the next Korean president would be able to take this as the starting point for relations between the two Koreas, and also, of course, between North Korea and the U.S. I think it is still a bit soon to know whether President Moon has been successful or not with his move, because a peace declaration would actually be a symbolic change, and therefore you could argue that his policy had been a success. If the peace declaration doesn't come to happen, I wouldn't call his policy a failure, because he was given a really bad hand, especially with President Trump in the U.S. and his erratic approach towards North Korea. But you could argue that he did try, and he actually showed that dialogue could bring change to the Korean Peninsula, something that wasn't really clear before he came to office.
And also, do you think North Korea would be happy to sign a formal end of the Korean War? And if it were to happen, do you think the regime would modify its behavior in any way, or will we continue to see more of the same?
So if sanctions relief, a change in its economic relationship with South Korea, with the US, with the rest of the world. So I think that North Korea wouldn't sign a formal end of war agreement just for the sake of it. They would want something else in return. We could also talk, for example, about political relations between the US, diplomatic relations between the US and North Korea being established. In terms of changing its behavior, well, history tells us that North Korea goes back to its provocations fairly often when it feels displeased with the behavior of South Korea and the US. So I think that we would see maybe a change in the long term, but in the short term, I wouldn't expect much change from North Korea, especially if at some point it feels that any negotiation process between the two Koreas or with Washington is going nowhere from the perspective of Pyongyang.
Yeah, just while you're talking, we're looking at video of President Moon and Kim Jong-un walking along that walkway. It seems like an age ago now, unfortunately. But finally, North Korea says it's holding this Conference of Frontrunners of the Free Revolutions. It's quite a complicated thing to describe, really. But since this comes at the end of the first year of Kim Jong-un's 5-year economic plan, do you think Kim, because he skipped the first one, at least when he was leader in 2015, do you think he's going to show up in person this time? He didn't last time. Whether he does or not, what kind of message do you think he's going to send to these lower level officials?
Well, we saw that he reappeared finally today after a month with not public appearances. So this may suggest that he's willing to make an appearance in this conference and in Pyongyang as well, that he's showing his face in public once more. So I think he might be willing to do so this time. 5 years ago, he only sent a message to the forum, to the meeting. So this time he might be willing to make an appearance. If so, I would expect that his message wouldn't be too different from what we have seen over the past year. Essentially that the economic situation is not as good as it could be, and that North Koreans might have to tighten their belts, really, which has been the message that North Korea has been sending basically since the pandemic started. North Korea closed its borders, and from what we know, the economic situation significantly deteriorated within the country. So what I mean is that I would expect a fairly realistic assessment of where the North Korean economy is today from Kim Jong-un, if he either sends a message or actually decides to give a speech during the meeting.
All right. Now, that was Professor Ramon Pacheco, Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London, on the latest ongoings with North Korea. Thank you again for your insights, Professor.
Thank you. Have a good day.